So really happy to be here today. It's really great visiting this campus at this time of year and everything. It looks beautiful outside, and it's a lovely fall that we're having. So, make sure that we're on slideshow. All right, good to go. Also, like, so amazing for me that you guys are collectively doing the book as a book study, and that you guys are having conversations about it. And I hope to someday soon get a summary back from all the things that you guys are learning about your own campus and about how to extend this work as you are having these conversations. I really want to get the opportunity to learn from what you guys are doing as you guys are thinking about how to create an institution that is as supportive as possible from students from all the many different backgrounds that come together on college campuses. So I hope that a lot of what I'm talking about is done in a way that it's not a direct replication from the book. The good thing is that I hate repeating myself. So hopefully I will not be doing that here in this talk. And this really does, these issues of moving towards inclusion in many ways have come since doing the book and having lots of conversations around, then it meant having a lot of conversations around diversity and realizing how limited the ways that we talked about diversity, how limited that is, and really trying to move beyond that as just really have come out of these conversations. So the first thing I want to talk about is statistical diversity, and I found that doing these talks and having these conversations, it was really critical for me to know a little bit demographically around the campus that I was going to be talking with, because it changes. So I have a whole bunch of slides, and the slides that are shown versus hidden depend on the composition of the campus, because even though it's the same issue, the way it matters and the way that it manifests and experience on campus is really tied to the demographic composition of that campus, both now and how things have changed in recent history. And so I realized I had to start doing some of my own institutional research around each campus to make sure that I was framing it in the most connected way. And in doing that, came across this quote, which says that administrators often view diversity as a generalized characteristics of institutions and can be blind to the particular circumstances of the racial and ethnic groups that constitute that diversity. And so this is using the 2019, using IPEDS. So the categories are the categories that are there in IPEDS. Other groups also includes international students in those categories. And so this is also before the pandemic, because institutions are in a moment of flux. And so things may look actually a little bit different right now, and it may look a little different in the near future. But in this moment in time, this was 2019, this was the demographic composition of the campus. And this matters for how it's experienced as a whole, as still being a predominantly white institution. In the book, I use historically white institution because I have a couple of institutions that are no longer predominantly white, but still the culture of the institution is still one that comes out of being a historically white institution. And so even though the demographics may look very different, and there's an assumption that those demographics have transformed the culture of the institution, we actually have to look deeper to see whether it has actually transformed the culture of the institution. This is your recent 25-year history. And this matters because there could be a simple assumption that, that because the composition percent of students on campus that are white has decreased, that the job's been accomplished. The campus is statistically more diverse than it was 25 years ago. But there's a group that's particularly resistant to change. And generally, that means that it's not going to be simple recruitment strategies that may work for other groups on campus that are going to work for Black students on campus. It's also important to think and realize that a substantial amount of diversity that has happened on campus is also because what's in that other group are international students. And so that has increased a lot over this time period and does contribute to diversity, but it's experienced in particular ways. So it's just critical that we actually look a little bit deeper. We're going to come back to these numbers again later to think about another aspect of how it might matter for how students experience the campus. But the one flag, immediate flag, is just the idea that you're going to need to talk to some students to think about and understand what are some of the barriers to recruitment and retention of Black students in particular. As campuses and institutions go about this process of increasing diversity, that everything kind of suggests that we are going to be going through another wave of increasing diversity on college campuses. There are financial pressures that are going to be increasing diversity. There's change in the general composition of the US population that's going to push increase in diversity. And there's just an ideological push that's happening right now that's going to increase diversity. And so as that happens, particularly when we're thinking about Black and Latinx students, we need to think about this opportunity that we are creating. So colleges, as administrators and at institutions, we are thinking that we are doing a good, that as we go out, as we push, as we increase diversity, as we increase access, everything that we're doing under that umbrella is a social and public good. However, I argue that it's actually a high risk opportunity for Black and Latinx students. And that's because as we go out and increase diversity in those populations in particular, subgroups in the US, we are going to be increasing the numbers of low wealth students. We're going to be increasing the numbers of students that are first generation college students, the students from whom, if they don't persist through to graduation, this opportunity is a really risky one that we are creating. And so institutions may create a high-risk opportunity for historically marginalized low-wealth students. The risk is that leaving college with student debt, but without a degree to earn the wages necessary to service that debt. So as colleges has become astronomically expensive, it means that it's really risky to enroll, begin accumulating debt, but not persist all the way through to get a degree. This is no longer a low-risk opportunity. What we know from the research on default and student debt is that generally, if you persist and get your degree, you're still going to have this debt to service, but you're largely going to be able to service that debt. If you don't get your degree, you have a very high chance of defaulting on that debt because the wage bump comes from actually getting the certificate, actually getting the diploma, getting the degree. When we have those wage bumps at all of those different matriculation points, it's when the individual not just approaches the end, or it's not just the number of years, you really see the bump at the point of crossing that threshold. And so it's not just giving students the opportunity and saying, well, it's great that they came to campus, you know, they had courses, they were exposed to new things. it's really a shame that they didn't make it all the way through to get a degree. But it really is a bigger risk than that when you don't have the financial resources to service the debt. And we now know that like one semester is a lot of debt if you don't actually persist and get the degree. What are some missed opportunities along this pipeline? The first is kind of like where we generally actually tend to spend most of our time as institutions, and that's in the recruitment and getting them to campus. And so that is in work that we do as universities with high schools in order to make students our college-ready students, make sure that they go through their application process, that they have counseling, academic counseling, and all of those things, the way that we support high schools. And that's what a lot of my work was, it still is, in that framework of ensuring that historically marginalized students have all of the supports that they need going through K-12 to ensure that they come high school graduation, they have the background, they have the resources, they have what they need to make it possible for them to go to college. I was, before I did this work, and what spurred this work was I used to be on that framework of it's about getting them into college. And I didn't really worry what happened to them once they got into college. It was really focusing on that first period. But as I learned a lot more around the challenges with persistence and the devastating consequences really that are experienced when you incur that debt but don't persist, that's when I started to think a little bit more, quite a bit more, around what is it that's happening on campus and in these institutions that might be making it hard for students to persist. And so really thinking that two parts, it's making sure that they're college ready and then get to campus, and then once they're on campus, making sure that they are persisting. So we spend a lot of our resources and time here, and actually in many ways less over the things that we have more control over, which is what happens when they get to campus and persist. And when we're thinking about this persistence piece of what happens when they get to campus, we're really thinking around from kind of like that timeline from when they get here. How are we doing orientation? Are we differentiating orientation for the needs of different subgroups of students, or are we assuming that students have the same level of missing information that they might need, or the same level of sense of belonging? And so for some students, we don't need to include work on ensuring that they feel a right to this campus, to ensure that they feel belonging on this campus. For some students, it is all you have to do is admit them, and they are going to march right in with a sense of belonging. For other students, it needs to be admission plus work when they actually get here to make sure that they actually believe that you want them here. And so there are some things there where we need to think about, well, what are we doing at orientation that needs to be differentiated based on students' backgrounds? It's also, what is the kind of guidance that they get here? Call it, in the book I use the term culturally competent, culturally relevant guidance, and give the example, this was our examples that we used of Latinx men, and the idea, but it also is very relevant for Black men, that there is a supporting one's family, being a credit to one's community, and having a really career-focused orientation for how you might get somebody through this process versus a more liberal arts, explore, learn, grow orientation for how you might get through college. And for some students, it needs to be like a really clear attachment to what are going to be the financial and career payoffs for doing this in order to keep them, make this process sticky for them and not make it seem like it's a journey with no end that I really can't afford to do. It's not in the book, it's in a report that we did, which was on students' concerns and fears that college just was not going to pay off in the end. And we found that it didn't matter if they were, this was the same kind of fear of like, I'm in here, I'm accumulating debt, maybe this is not a good idea and I should stop now to cut my losses. What we know is that, no, once you're in, persist, complete. But there was, among lots of students, like, maybe I should cut my losses now. And it didn't matter if they were in, this was the same thing on students that had as their majors, architecture, bio, and a clear professionalization track, history, any of the psychology, any of the social sciences, English. Major didn't matter. What mattered was more whether they had a family background and network that allowed them to see that persisting pays off. All they could see was that each semester I'm accumulating more debt in this uncertain thing where I don't have a community and network that confirms to me that this is going to pay off. So maybe I should stop now. And that's information that institutions can readily communicate to students what the career and financial payoffs are for persisting and what this will look like. So the way that I talk about this is that it's not, I'm not spending a lot of time talking about what's happening in terms of my guidance, motivational guidance about the college experience. My motivational guidance for these students is around the past college. So college is a mechanism and a way to get you to this professional future, to get you to this income future, which is what you need in order to stick through this moment in time when it's feeling really uncertain. And so that's what I mean by, as an example of culturally relevant guidance. My son doesn't really need that kind of guidance. He's okay wandering through, doing this, doing that, and is this, being a time in life where, he's learning, he's exploring, he's doing an internship in one field, an internship in another field. Another student that does not have, a parent like me where that's not of concern, each exploration actually kind of adds to their uncertainty about, well, maybe this actually won't pay off because I'm not seeing a clear trajectory through this in order to be able to pay this back. And lots of other examples, but really needing to think about that kind of, those little water droplets in the middle, those are all things that we have a lot of control over as institutions. And a lot of them are informational that we have a lot of control over as institutions in order to increase persistence. So it's kind of like the idea that college is hard for everybody. College is a time of uncertainty for everybody, but the uncertainties are different, and they're very different from students from historically marginalized groups. And we need to think about those differences. And so the idea is that, just a summary, is that without reform for how we help students navigate college, the one downside of diversifying higher education is that increasing access to a degree quickly becomes increasing access to unmanageable student debt. So let's be really clear that unless we ensure that students from historically marginalized groups are supported through the persistence piece, diversifying higher ed is not really a, I am losing the word that I need, but it's not a good for everyone. So we really need to just think about what we are doing in the risk and opportunities that we are creating for students. So as we move forward to then thinking about inclusion, which is what that is all about, to reduce the risk, I want to start by kind of clarifying some terms and thinking about where we are. And I'll give you a moment to read that slide. And I will actually read it because I don't necessarily know if the people hybrid can read it. Need to remember, hybrid situation. Okay, so legal barriers to the enrollment of previously excluded groups have been dropped. substantial numbers of students from historically marginalized groups now receive offers of acceptance and enroll. And policies have been written to tell members of the campus community what forms of speech and behaviors will not be tolerated, as well as what forms of hurtful speech are protected. These advances were good for a time, but students, staff, and faculty from historically marginalized groups are now asking their institutions to move beyond diversity and toward diversity and tolerance and toward full inclusion. And so that's just what I wrote to kind of, as I was trying to frame for people that were asking this question of like, what are students asking for? Why are they upset? Why are they agitating? We have accepted them and admitted to them. They're here. They want more than just being here. So, diversity, who is on campus? How many individuals from which groups? Tolerance, what one can and cannot legally say and do with regard to the hate and hostility that targets members of legally protected groups. Inclusion. How can we foster and leverage interpersonal interactions among and across a broad range of status and identity groups to strengthen campus belonging for all students? Inclusion is hard. Inclusion is, those are our interpersonal interactions. That's where belonging happens. So diversity policies, necessary. You have to bring them here. Tolerance policies, necessary. We have to reduce hate in order to create a safe enough environment that we can then think about how do we intentionally create opportunities, how do we intentionally teach ways of interacting across social boundaries, status boundaries. So our diversity goals are how can we recruit? How can we remove barriers to enrollment? Our tolerance goals, how can our policies reduce the use of hate speech in public places? How can we increase student, faculty, and staff awareness of their rights and responsibilities for creating a learning experience that is free of hostility? And then our inclusion goals. That's how can we build the skills necessary for faculty to create and engage students in diverse learning environments. Most faculty at higher ed institutions came up in a time when they didn't have to worry about these issues. And that means that many don't have the skills. These are skills. Many don't have the skills to recognize these challenges in their classrooms, to think about how their instruction, the way they facilitate things, can either harm or help inclusion. So if students feel included, if they feel inclusion in the classroom, they're going to feel it and extend it to other spaces. They're not going to extend it from other spaces into the classroom. How can we increase the range of opportunities that enable individuals from historically marginalized groups to see themselves and their culture represented in the constellation of old and new traditions that comprise the culture of an institution? So all of those intangible things, we talked this morning with some of the faculty members and staff that I met with, the art on the walls, the spaces in particular around campus, all of the things that you see and that you engage with 24/7 that are passive. So passive communication of culture, passive communication of belonging, that is happening all the time. Students are engaging and experiencing with that all the time. It's really critical that we listen to and hear them when they talk about how entering buildings with particular names and particular legacies affects them. It's, made me say, well, what's the big deal? It's, it's the name of a building, but it's actually the case that if you are an individual where there's a very negative historical relationship between who you are and your identity, sense of identity, and that individual in that building that it's named after, it means that every time you go in and out of that building, you are reminded of that hierarchy, of that positioning, and you are reminded of that devaluation of your historical position and of your legacy. And so it is actually, it's the case that it happens repeatedly, time and time again. And it really does matter for how that student enters the classroom, the extent to which that they are triggered passing in and out of that building, reminded each and every time that they do that. So it really does matter for their experience of the learning environment. And I'll just segue for a minute. The other work that I do on trauma, one of the things, trauma and how schools can support students, is that aspect of triggering. It really does matter, because when you walk into a building that might, what's this space of learning, that has either a particular huge name or plaque centrally at the forefront, or statue centrally at the forefront, that is associated with devaluing of your identity and your history, it's something that you cannot control as an individual, the extent to which it triggers your stress system and your stress response. Every time you do that, that kind of noticing of that kind of awareness of it, it triggers a little bump in your heart rate, in your stress hormones, and those things go with you as you enter into the classroom. There is an actual physiological aspect of triggering emotions that then affects learning. And those are kind of some of the reasons why it matters so much. So moving to kind of thinking about, like, how do we move forward with many of these things? Inclusion implies that someone has been excluded at some point in time and prevented from full participation in a community that they desire to access. And this matters because when we're thinking about diversity and bringing students to campus, and when we're thinking about inclusion, it means that there is there are beliefs and there are emotions associated with those beliefs about belonging that as an institution, we need to intentionally signal that things have changed. That goes beyond simply admitting somebody. It is intentional work to help somebody overcome the assumption that is real based on historical experiences that I am not welcome there. Just admitting me, just opening the door and saying, come in, does not in and of itself overcome that historical legacy. Intentional work needs to happen to communicate that things have changed as a microaggression. So how do we respond? How do we support people when they're just super sensitive and they just see everything and anything as somehow aggressing against their identity and culture? And again, it just so happened that we were collecting longitudinal data and were able to use it. So I knew that microaggressions mattered, and so we were collecting information on microaggressions. But this was very intentionally to show and illustrate that it's not indiscriminate. They perceive it quite accurately. So hopefully you can still hear me. I'll be loud enough as I walk around a little bit. There are three groups, which is students who attended high schools that were 75% or more white, so predominantly white. Those who were in diverse high schools, it's a big range. And then students who were in high schools that were predominantly of their same race or ethnicity. So if they were black, predominantly black. If they were Latinx, they were predominantly Latinx high schools. So what we see, these are Latinx students in predominantly white high schools. When they go from high school to their first year of college, so there were these predominantly or historically white colleges, we see no real change in their perception of academic microaggressions. And if anyone has questions, I can describe the scale a little bit. It's the scale that we developed for the study. So their perception of microaggressions in high school versus transition to college, no real change. We actually saw a decrease. So this is black students who transitioned from high school to college. They experienced a decrease in racial and ethnic microaggressions. It was really interesting that being in predominantly white high school is a very identity-threatening space for black students. In many ways because they're young, they're still developing, and trying to navigate it really threatens their sense of self in an academic space. And so those are actually students who come to campus quite vulnerable. But coming to campus, they actually see an improvement. When we look at students who were in this diverse space, this is what we see. So in high school, they perceived less microaggressions and no real change in coming to college. Same thing. So we're seeing that where they were in high school, they perceived the level of microaggressions in the ways that we would expect. They didn't all perceive high microaggressions. Now, these are kids who were coming from predominantly same race high schools. What they both saw in getting to college was an increase in microaggressions. And here's the also interesting thing. So they were in high schools where identity-wise, the racial and ethnic identity felt fairly, not completely, but fairly protected and hadn't experienced that. And so for these students coming to college, they don't have the skills to navigate what they suddenly experience as this increase in academic inferiority in classroom spaces. And so these are students who are very vulnerable from our interviews we found to withdrawing from that academic space because they suddenly feel vulnerable. And unlike our kids who were in predominantly white high schools, they didn't have the skills that they had learned in those high schools to help them navigate it here. And like I said, this was just to show it's not indiscriminate students, black and Latinx students, just perceiving microaggressions everywhere. They perceive, and also when you see the big racial difference, it's because race also matters. Race and ethnicity matters for your baseline level of experiencing microaggressions. Anti-blackness matters. Want to transition and say a little bit now about institutions and what we've done. And so American universities embarked on a diversity push without a plan for how to make diversity work, especially regarding the increasing conflict that is inherent in increasing diversity. So the reality is, the psychology, the sociology, the everything of it is that increased diversity means increased conflict. Conflict is not necessarily a bad thing. It just means it requires an intentional response. However, universities and institutions assumed cultural assimilation when they increased diversity, that students would come and that they would assimilate into the dominant culture of the institution. That did happen for a while, but as diversity increases, students and faculty and others are no longer willing to accept the diversity bargain, which is that you can come as long as you're willing to jettison or leave behind your cultural practices and needs that might be different from the dominant one of the institution that you're entering. As numbers increase, individuals from historically marginalized groups are no longer willing to sacrifice those aspects of themselves. And that's why you get increased conflict and increased pushback. And that's why institutions have to now be intentional. They need to expect and anticipate increased conflict and think about and plan for what they're going to do. So diversity conflict can be used to spur self-reflection, perspective taking, and other aspects of interpersonal growth. But you have to help people, kids and adults, do that. That is not, it's not natural. So statistical diversity is only the prerequisite for creating campus environments that deliberately teach students how to identify and move beyond their biases, understand broad group differences, as well as diversity within groups. Needing to understand both of those things helps people engage with others that they see as other and develop meaningful interpersonal relationships across group boundaries. A lot of, and before I go in, I'll just put this up there to help us understand why. The overwhelming majority of college students attended same race and ethnicity elementary and high schools. They're coming into colleges like this one where all of this is new, where the only thing often that they have as knowledge of the other are through media. And that means that oftentimes the knowledge of the other are very negative and caustic stereotypes. And that's what the lens through which they're engaging with each other. And so all of these things require intentional learning experiences that allow people to make mistakes, learn from mistakes, and not have it be really like high stakes, where the learning only occurs through really high stakes incidents. But we are teaching, ensuring that lots of students, through lots of smaller interactions, have the skills and awareness where they're able to support each other across race and cross status boundaries when big high stakes incidents happen. When big high stakes incidents happen, it's going to be kind of how my peers, how those that my acquaintances, how the people that I see in my classroom respond and interact and communicate and talk about it. It's going to matter for how I perceive like that high stakes incident that happens. So, and these are not mine. These comes from the general research that's out there. So actions that are kind of shown to improve these things are facilitated casual events to help students gain the tools for cross-race and ethnicity dialogue while making new acquaintances. So, for example, one of the things that I can call up my institution does that I don't like is that they have these, they call them diversity dialogues. I think they still call them diversity dialogues, where they bring, invite students and faculty and staff to come into a room. They have a facilitator that has set up these structured conversations where you ask people, where they ask the white people in the room to ask the minority people in the room at their table to like tell me about a really awful discriminatory experience that you've had, and then we're gonna work through it. And I'm just like, no. Can we start small? And then maybe like not have to do that actually, but because there's not enough small and informal interactions, that they create these really big high stakes events where you're gonna bring people together, you're gonna ask people to bare their souls, and then they're just gonna go away. And actually, and I have never participated in these, because I was like, I think I might walk away not feeling okay with what could possibly happen. I might be at one of those tables, somebody might ask something that I'm like, wait, what? What did you just say in response to me telling you about some major experience that I've had? And for the other person, they may just be genuinely curious, but the way it happens, without skill, without nuance, could then actually ultimately make things worse. Particularly if I'm in there, I share stuff, we have what may not be the best follow-up questioning at the table, and then it's just done and we go away. And for months after, I'm like, I'm processing what's happened. This is not feeling well. I'm going into my classroom spaces. They're still just as they were. I'm going into other spaces. They're still just as they were. And I am left with this but I just kind of told you about something really traumatic, really difficult. And so let's start small. Facilitated casual events where we are making sure that they're intentionally diverse. And we're making sure that as administrators, we are staging our people in there to help having some of those conversations and facilitating those interactions, but they're not high stakes. Peer education within group, where you have freshmen that may be supported by juniors and seniors of their same group, but those juniors and seniors have received the training and support. And those juniors and seniors are those who do this kind of justice work on campus or are really advocates for many of those things and have those skills. But we are learning that within group, learning of those things is a safe space. So let me say this more plain. White students need safe spaces also in order for them to ask questions about interacting with other groups, because that means that they're doing it in a space that is not threatening for them. And that actually improves their ability to then maybe not ask those questions in those ways in other spaces. And then also intentionally community building efforts that are those kind of clubs, diverse clubs that sustained. So smaller group clubs for individuals students who want more invested in those justice, in racial justice and types of things, that want to build and work on that then you have also those students who are building diverse, sustained relationships. So that there are these kind of different levels of things that that an institution, as administrators, that you guys do the work to create these opportunities at all these different levels. And then students just experience these things as a part of what it means to come to this campus, is that all of these things are there as opportunities. And I was just pausing because I was like, I think I lost total track of time. Okay. Because mine is on a different time zone. That's why. I was like, I didn't know I did not go back in time like this. So how much time do I have left? About 40
minutes.
Okay, I'm not going to talk for that long. So actually, I'm going to, any questions at this point? Thoughts, reactions?
Hi there. I was wondering if you'd offered your university any feedback about the diversity dialogue situation?
I was there when they were so I've been there. When they were developing them, yes, I did. I did.
Didn't make a difference.
So may I ask, what is your role at this institution?
Sure. My name is Anne-Marie Russell. I am the Associate Dean for Student Recruitment, Inclusion, and Success at the Commonwealth Honors College.
Okay. The one thing that you learn really quickly as faculty is that your institution doesn't want to hear from you. I don't know if there's other faculty here. So it's so much easier for me to communicate my research findings in ways that apply to practice at other institutions than at my own institution. I will also say I led our campus climate survey at my institution because I had like the technical expertise to do it. But when it came to the interpretation of what we will use it to do, it went back to administrators, and yes, that's the reality of that. Yeah. No, I definitely said, no, this is not a great idea. Other comments, thoughts?
So going back to your slide that had the water droplets, where you talked about persistence, and there was a combined, one part was college ready, and then the next part was, I think it was about the persistence. So how do we work with high schools to make the definition of college ready actually meet what college ready means on campus?
So the question is, how do we work with high schools to ensure that college ready means what it on campus? So I'm going to assume that you're saying that college readiness is more than academic preparation?
Exactly.
Yes. Yeah, exactly. Yes. Preparation. It's tough. I actually see that as a bigger challenge. So one, I would say, is working with guidance counselors or professional associations. Because high school counselors get their information and resources through professional organizations. So working with professional organizations, high school counseling organizations, is actually a really great way that would then developing like materials, brochures, practice briefs and stuff like that is going to be your best way for disseminating information and communicating information, and actually doing workshops for those organizations, those professional organizations. That's how you can start to get to those organizations beyond kind of working school by school. There's, of course, school by school for whatever the schools that are the highest sending schools. Actually, no. This information is more for your low sending schools that you're going to be working with if you're trying to increase, because those are the ones where the students are going to be coming here without that sense of what it means to be a student here. So it's really those organizations that you're trying to reach out to. But it's a bigger issue. It's how we understand what college is as a society. Meaning we all know that there's that hidden curriculum piece of college, but it's not really a popular understanding of what college is. And the other piece that I say is the challenge is that and I don't think we can't unring that bell. We think of, and we've created our financial structures are such, employment structures, that you need to get a college degree to get like the lowest level entry jobs. Having a college degree matters so much for the salary that you're going to get. And that kind of fuels this kind of push for everybody goes to college. You know, it's the thing that everybody should do. And the idea also fuels the kind of like the college is just about academic learning, continuing academic learning. It's this kind of bigger understanding of how you do college, how you persist in college, that needs to be communicated a little bit more. And I would say professional organizations would be really critical for doing workshops with those organizations. And then also any schools where they don't have a long history of sending students to this institution, if you're going to now target some of those new schools, it also needs to come with helping them help their students prepare for what it means to be a student here. And also what you're doing here at this campus in terms of knowing that I call it triaging. So there's lots of information that administrators have about who's coming that can be used to triage students into different groups for different orientation messages. And there's actually research that shows, there's one that I cite in the book that is, what they did was they did the orientation as either an individualistic orientation or a communal orientation. And this was orientation to what it means to succeed here at this college, at this university. And they found that that one was with Latinx students, when they did that communal orientation, that collective help-seeking orientation for how one succeeds in college, that they did significantly better in terms of their persistence. It had no effect on white students, but it did have an effect on Latinx students in terms of their persistence, because they had an orientation that made it seem it's okay to need collective help to get through this. And so they then reached out for collective help when they struggled, rather than thinking everybody else must know individually, so I should know individually also. And again, that's just an idea of what can be done by segmenting student groups at orientation to make sure that they get the messages and information that they need to feel belonging and to navigate college in a way that they can use their cultural competencies to navigate this institution. Mm-hmm.
You highlighted the importance of helping faculty gain skills to help students succeed in a culturally diverse environment. And I wonder if you have any thoughts about how we can engage faculty in taking advantage of those opportunities to develop their skills in this area, incentivize, encourage, cajole, anything on that front.
Yeah. So the question is how to incentivize faculty to engage in learning to build their cultural competencies. I don't know what it is here, but you can get us to do a lot for research funds. And it actually doesn't have to be a lot. It actually doesn't have to be a lot, but you can get us to do a lot for research funds. At my institution, for example, teaching in the undergraduate college core classes, one way they incentivize that, and it works decently well, is that we get an additional like $3,000 into our research accounts for teaching in those like core classes. So you're incentivizing not based on teaching the class. So what you're incentivizing is the thing where at a research institution matters is having those unrestricted research funds where I can hire a TA for my research and other things like that. But I'm teaching, the class and doing that. So really thinking about what, not necessarily, I'm not sure what your role is, but not what matters for you, but really what matters for me. And then incentivizing what you want based on giving me what I want is what I might think about.
All right, thank you for the talk. So let's piggyback off of that last question and your response, and let's pretend that I'm a GPD, and I'm in
What's a GPD?
A graduate program director.
Okay.
And I'm in a graduate program, I direct a graduate program that's rapidly diversifying, vis-a-vis the last 10 or 15 years. What would be your advice to that GPD to look out for in terms of the three domains that you talked about, inclusion, tolerance, and I can't remember the...
Diversity, inclusion, and tolerance.
Right. Because, and the reason I'm asking this is kind of like a leading question, right? Because I think if departments and GPDs, this is shifting from talking about undergraduates to talking if you're thinking about GPDs and departments, these issues can really taint the atmosphere of a department for the worse, and it can be very difficult to correct if it's not paid attention to. When I say difficult, I mean it can take a long time to turn that ship around in terms of climate. So what are your thoughts on that?
And is this, just make sure I understand, that the graduate students are diversifying in terms of the characteristics of the demographic characteristics of the graduate students, but the climate of the department for support of maybe their types of, their research questions, topics, ideas, and things like that?
The department may or may not be prepared for that rapid diversification.
Yeah. Yeah. I don't know. It's a little different in the sense of graduate students are. It depends on how much they are a part of the institution, because sometimes graduate students can be, they're part of the institutions, but they're not, because once they're done class, so once for some, when the climate, I'm not sure, I'm pretty sure I don't have a good answer for you, but I can say that when it doesn't go the right way, what happens that I've experienced is that those diverse graduate students come, take their classes. As soon as they done with coursework, they separate from the department, and they largely do everything else remote. Even if they're physically there, they're remote, because they don't, they're going to write their dissertation, do all their work and things like that, but they're not part of the culture and development of the department. And so they'll come, take their 2 years of courses, or maybe 3, depending on the department, and they have, because graduate students have a little bit more agency in their ability to isolate themselves and separate themselves and just come and take what I need, and and then I'm going to write my dissertation, do my field work, do my research and things like that. So I think it in part depends on the ability of students to do that in a department, but that's one of the things that I've seen happen when it's not there, and or a couple of faculty get really burdened meeting the needs of those diverse students, and that's also a problem and doesn't work well. But yeah, I would say to me that's trickier than undergraduates, because faculty perceive graduate students very differently in terms of their responsibility for graduate student well-being, which is oftentimes not much responsibility for graduate student well-being in terms, and there's less supports for graduate student well-being versus undergraduate student well-being, and our willingness and our openness as faculty to also see undergraduate student well-being, like their well-being as part of something that, because they're younger, whereas with graduate students, we're much more likely to kind of see, well, they need to just do the work. And I'm sure you're nodding, seeing that like, they're here to do the work, and if they should do the work. So yeah, as Gil said, I'm pretty sure I don't have a good answer for you.
I have a question from the live stream. Someone was wondering, it's a two-part question. Can you elaborate more on the difference between safe space, brave space, and counterspaces? And the second part is, in the book focused on students, should counterspaces also be a space for faculty members to engage in?
So yes, counterspaces should also be for faculty. Faculty oftentimes can be more isolated. Faculty from historically marginalized backgrounds can oftentimes be more isolated than students, because oftentimes I've had that experience of when I started my institution in my department, and this is like 2005. I was the only faculty member of color, period. And there was gender diversity, but, and in that moment, there had been some racial and ethnic diversity before, and there is some more racial and ethnic diversity now. But when I joined and was for about 4 years, it was me, myself, and I, as all racial and ethnic diversity in my department. And that's not uncommon. And so oftentimes faculty need to come together across different departments and divisions even in order to kind of get that cultural support along racial and ethnic lines. So safe spaces, brave spaces, and counterspaces, they're all the same in the context of what individuals from historically marginalized groups are asking for. They are different in how broader society has named them and attached various political ideologies and to them. So in the popular debate, safe spaces has become this perception of places that individuals and students from historically marginalized groups go in order to not be intellectually challenged. They're going to go to these safe spaces where they can block out ideas that might challenge their own, and they don't have to try to stretch and grow. Brave spaces are often attached with the kind of idea that it's spaces that allow, sometimes, I've seen it used both ways, where individuals from majority groups can be brave in their acknowledgement of marginalizations of others and be brave in their allyship, but it's also been used as spaces where marginalized individuals can be brave in calling out experiences. And counterspaces, in terms of how I'm using them, is the idea that in an institution like this one, when we look at the numbers, it means that if I'm a Black student at this institution, the vast majority of my time is going to be in contexts where I am marginalized. And counterspaces is a space that's needed in order to bring a critical mass enough of students of, and if we're thinking about race and ethnicity, it can work for many different identity groups. In this institution, I need a counterspace that's bringing enough of a critical mass of students like me so that I can relax. Worry about how my racial presentation is perceived and experienced by others. That's one of the big things that our counterspace does in an institution like this. And I will skip forward to just kind of defining what I'm calling counterspace. And so the difference between safe, brave, and counterspaces depends on who you're talking to. And which is what I always tell, in our research methods classes, how is it defined? You have to first figure out how is something defined, because just because I say counterspace and you say counterspace doesn't mean that we're talking about the same thing. For me, in counterspaces are safe, and counterspaces enable people to be brave. So students who experience stereotyping, discrimination, and alienation appear to feel a greater sense of institutional connectedness when they participate in campus counterspaces. So facilitating students' abilities to participate in counterspaces increases their broader campus engagement. It doesn't decrease it, it increases it, because when students who are racially and ethnically marginalized feel identity threat in the broader space, if they don't have the supports to manage that, they withdraw into themselves, they withdraw into their dorm room, they isolate from campus. They stay off campus. So you actually get less campus engagement by opposing Counterspaces. You get more by supporting students' abilities to do that. Because remember, I think I said that this morning. I don't think I said that. Yeah. They could go elsewhere to other institutions where they're not in so small a demographic minority. They're choosing to come here. They know they're not going to be in the demographic majority coming here. There are reasons they're coming here. They want to be here. One of the things that I learned when doing kind of the campus climate survey work at my institution is one of the reasons why students feel, historically marginalized students feel so upset. Let me just do it that way, upset. And are pushing back so much is because we as institutions have done a lot of work in our recruitment to convince them that if they come here, things will be different. They believe it. It's part of the reason why they decided to come. If they then get here and then experience all of those historical aspects that are still lingering of marginalization and of exclusion, they're suddenly unexpectedly hurt. And they're acting out of that hurt. So it's because they've believed it. It's because they want to engage in a truly racially inclusive climate that they respond so negatively when they feel exclusion. And it is because they feel that exclusion that then they are looking for Counterspaces. They're like looking, like, where can I go to help me manage how to learn how to deal with these feelings now that I wasn't expecting? And this is just really quickly just to show demographic marginalization and how much it matters. We looked at those numbers at the beginning. So this is the racial composition, fall 2009. It's really, really important to get the idea of what it feels to be in the middle. And when you're such a small percent of the campus, you're feeling marginalization all the time. And we know from the research that demographic marginalization translates very immediately to an emotional, cognitive and emotional experience of marginalization. So these numbers really matter. And it matters that they're by gender, because undergrads are still in that space where they don't just see themselves as like black students, they see themselves as black women and black men. So undergrads are still fairly gender segregated in their social relationships. And so, in particular, we know that it's the black men where they're really trying to, like, is there anybody else on this campus like me? And really need to find each other to get that cultural support. And so this was just to note, again, that this demographic picture matters for needing to very intentionally create and facilitate and foster belongingness and inclusion. So the kind of conclusion to all of that is just that Counterspaces enable adaptive responding. So in Counterspaces, through support from each other, through support from student affairs administrators that might facilitate some of those Counterspaces, students learn the emotional, psychological, and behavioral capacities that enable them to cope with and resist oppression, thereby exhibiting resilience. And by exhibiting that resilience, they're going to engage more in the campus. And so it really is not something that should be feared by institutions, that creating and facilitating these Counterspaces for many different identity groups across campus that it is breaking apart the campus. There's this kind of fear that that is going to segregate and break kids apart. It actually brings them back into the campus. So these are just some narrative examples that are not necessary because I talked about them. I just want to end with this, which is the question that I often get, are racial and ethnic counterspaces divisive spaces? And I always say, yes, it is. They are self-segregating spaces. And I am advocating the opportunity to enable students to self-segregate. And it's only a problem if the culture of the institution presents racial and ethnic minority students with false choices. The choice that you either are a student of UMass Amherst, or you're a Black student of UMass. And the reality, though, is that we all go through and engage in multiple different spaces. Like, I might be a crafter, and I want to be with my crafting friends, but it doesn't mean that I don't also want to, at other times, be with my academic friends. Type of, just pulling an analogy out there. But oftentimes, in our interviews, we found that students, Black students and Latinx students, felt like the intentional association with other Black or other Latinx students was perceived as signaling that I don't want to be a part of this campus. And that doesn't necessarily need to be, it's a false choice. And so it meant that it was, for some, like a really high bar to engage in these counterspaces, because they felt like it was always like a political statement. And sometimes it was actually wanting to be the opposite. They wanted it to just be a space where I just wanted to go hang out and relax and to have my Blackness not be such a thing in a space. But it actually, and for some, even though that's what they wanted, because the culture of the institution was such that you're either one of us as an institution, or you are associating with the Black students on campus, or you're associating with the Latinx students on campus, and that is perceived as rejection from the broad community as a whole. Some of this can be mitigated by the institution really fostering and supporting many different counter spaces for many different groups, because Black students and Latinx students aren't the only ones who need support. When we did our campus climate survey, it was initially going to be, when they asked me to do it, just about race and ethnicity. And I said the only way I was going to do it is if it included race and ethnicity as a major part, gender, religious orientation and affiliation, religious affiliation, and gender was very broadly defined as identity and identification, as well as sexual orientation and identification, in order to be able to show with the data that that individuals from a range of historically marginalized groups that are visible and less visible felt different levels of belongingness and different levels of safety on campus. And so, again, normalizing the idea that there are times when I'm in the majority and times when I'm myself in the majority. Rarely ever for me specifically, but you know what I mean. For any individual, there are times when that same individual, based on one aspect of their identity that's central to them, they are marginalized, they're feeling marginalized, and then there are other aspects. And so we could show that the same individual who may be a white man is does not indicate any aspects when those are the aspects of his identity that we ask him to speak about. But if he is also of a marginalized sexual orientation, when we ask him to speak about, on the survey, respond to those aspects of his identity and how that is affecting different aspects of his sense of belonging on campus, you got to see a difference. And again, it was just helping to communicate that it's how much our identity and the extent to which a marginalized aspect of our identity is activated affects all these other aspects of our experience. That's it.